Art history, modern art. Okay, this is our last of the major eras here, and with modern art, we're going to break it into two sections because it's a long section. And the first section that we'll look at in this video is basically the early modern art. And so that's basically art since 1900. After 1900, that's considered the modern art era. And here, excuse me, we're going to see a big paradigm shift. And so a paradigm would be kind of the focus of something here. And so traditionally our paradigm in art is that it's based on verisimilitude, which is, how close to life-likeness we can make something. And so we'll see naturalism a lot, something that dates back from really the Renaissance into Baroque on through French academic art, all through that time period. That's kind of the main focus for what art is based on. Here we're going to see a shift from that basis of naturalism. We're going to see a shift towards the paradigm of expression. Okay, so that's going to be very important here because with expression, we're going to see different forms of art that instead of the representational art that we see, we'll still see that, but we'll also see a lot of abstraction. And one of the reasons that artists are doing work that is very abstract is because they're trying to be very expressive and they're trying to do new and different things. One of the reasons they're trying to do new and different things is if we look at the modern era especially, but certainly here in the early 1900s, a good word to think of when we think of modernism is the word progression. That there's a real belief in the idea of progression, especially a belief in technology and sciences and how they're making the world basically a better place here. For instance, if we look at technology, we have now the telegram, and by 1902 we basically have the cable from all the way, the transatlantic cable, which was done I think in 1866, that connected North America with Europe. We've completed the same thing over in the Pacific with Asia and North America by 1902. So here the whole world is connected a lot quicker in terms of the message of information than previously. That used to take several weeks for that to happen. Now we can transfer information in a matter of minutes. And so that's really speeding up the pace of life. We also have the automobile around the early 1900s. That's quickening the pace of life. We have the development of flight in 1903 or so with airplanes. So that's something that's contributing to the pace of life, the way that life is lived. In addition to that, we have mass media, radio, along with the telegram, like I mentioned, are two developments that around this time here are really changing things. We also have the sciences. If we look at the end of the 1800s, we have like the development of the X-ray, which is pretty amazing to be able to look at bones and somebody's body without having to open up their skin. It's pretty crazy. We also have, for instance, Einstein. He publishes 4 papers in 1905 that revolutionized physics and really the way that a lot of people look at the world. In addition to that, around 1900, we have Sigmund Freud publishing his interpretations of dreams, and so that's going to be something very influential as well. And so with all of these progressions in science and technology, the idea of progression is going to hit art, and art is going to want to be progressive like the sciences. And so that's why we see people doing these new and different things. And so tied in with that is the idea of the avant-garde. That the avant-garde is basically a word that means ahead of your time or ahead of the trend. And so that was personified by artists we looked at last time. Someone like Van Gogh. When Van Gogh was alive, he only sold 1 painting. So he was not popular when he was alive, but then afterwards he becomes very, very popular. He's one of the most popular artists even of today. So this idea of the avant-garde is something that these artists are looking at, and it's a real ideal here, especially since they were so interested in the idea of expression. Alright, so our first artist here is Henry Matisse. This is called The Joy of Life. And in his work, very flatly, he has a quote here that says, "What I am after above all is expression." Okay, and so he finds detail distracting. He finds three-dimensional form distracting. That to him, that's kind of something that he doesn't want to worry about, because he's not trying to make something look like the natural world. He's just essentially decorating a surface here. And that surface itself is flat, so he's going to make his shapes flat. So he's really going to concentrate more on the curvilinear nature of line here, rather than exactly describing form. It's more important that it shows here kind of the stress feel free of the joy of life. And so he's using these bright colors as well, because that more fully expresses what he's trying to express here, the joy of life. And so this is the work of Matisse, and he really does, throughout most of his life, really try to express this sentiment. Even when he, towards the end of his life, as his health starts to fail and he's not able to paint, he does these works of art with collage. And so it works pretty well with the style, since he worked kind of in a flat style anyway. And he was more interested in shapes and colors, which is what we see here being shown with his collage work. The painting on the top, the collage on the top, it's called The Sorrows of the King. And on the bottom there, you can see how his work would look like in a gallery setting. Okay, another artist doing some really different, new, expressive type of work here in the early 1900s is Wassily Kandinsky. And on the left, we see Blue Mountain. And you can see there on the left, he is still working in a fairly representational way. At least we can tell that it's a blue mountain. We can tell we see these riders riding up the Blue Mountain on horseback there. And we can see something he did a lot here in that painting there on the left is that he used yellow, red, and blue a lot. He believed in using these triad of colors. He thought of art similar to music, that he was trying to have like certain harmonies and chords that would work in art like they do in music. And so one of the things he does is use these colors often. And if we look at a quote here, it's kind of a revealing statement by Mr. Kandinsky. And he says like that one of the biggest things that helped him kind of move forward in his art was a scientific development, and that was the further division of the atom. He says that the further division of the atom was to his soul like the crumbling of the whole world, which sounds pretty dramatic there. But we have to understand that for years and years it was thought the atom was the smallest thing that existed. And so when it was found out there was subatomic particles like electrons, neutrons, and protons, that was seen as kind of this truth that was seen to be untrue. And so it was seen as being kind of revolutionary, and so he decides to be even more bold and revolutionary in his work. And you can see in those two paintings on the right there how abstract he becomes, that there's really no reference here towards naturalism anymore, that we're really, really abstract. The work is about the aspects of its own design, the art elements, the basics like color, shape, those types of things. And so the one on the right is called Composition 7. He used composition a lot to name his works because, like I said, he thought of it as kind of like a musical thing. And the one on the right, bottom right, would be red, yellow, blue is the title of that one. Okay, so we become very abstract very quickly here. Another new and different type of art is the development of what we would call Cubism. And we have the two co-founders here. That's George Braque on the left with the painting The Portuguese, which is an example of analytic cubism. And on the right we see Pablo Picasso with violin, fruit, and wine glass. It's a collage here that he would work on. That's a later development, something called synthetic cubism, which they're a little bit different, but we're not going to go too much into why here. And there's a lot of theories with art critics that try to explain what Cubism is all about, because the the co-founders themselves don't give much explanation for it. They would have been kind of working in the same areas. I believe they shared a space here around this time, and so they would have had similar ideas probably flowing between them, and their work here exhibits some of the same traits here. But exactly what Cubism is about, there's a couple different theories. One theory states that something to the effect that they're trying to kind of overcome the flatness of the picture plane. I'm not sure if I'm really convinced with that theory. The other theory is that they're showing objects here from basically multiple vantage points. So they're trying to get kind of closer to the real aspect of something by seeing something from a lot of different angles and kind of putting them together in the same picture plane. That one to me makes a little bit more sense, but really it's the thing I think probably most revolutionary about it is the traditional sense of the picture plane here is obviously not being adhered to, that the normal convention of space is kind of being rearranged. In a lot of these you'll see, for instance, the eye in one location, and then where you would expect the nose, it's in a completely different location. And so that kind of rearranging of the picture plane is definitely something that we see in Cubist art. Okay, with this example, we see abstraction in sculpture, and this is the artist Konstantin Brancusi. And on the left, we see an example of a sculpture called Bird in Space, and on the right, we see an example of a sculpture called The Kiss. And with Brancusi here, he calls abstraction simplicity, and he says basically that one doesn't arrive at simplicity as an end in art, kind of paraphrasing here, but one gets there in approaching the real sense of things. And this is what we see a lot with abstraction, that it's not about exactly what the object looks like, it's more about the concept of something, or kind of boiling things down to their most essential. So on the left, if we look at this sculpture in the traditional sense, in the traditional paradigm of what it would look like, we would maybe think of a feather or maybe a pin quill, something like that. But if we look at the title, Bird in Space, we can see that what it's trying to show here is the idea of lightness, of aerodynamics, of the feeling of kind of maybe weightlessness of the bird flying into the air or space. On the right, we see the kiss, and we don't see the kiss shown in terms of the physical reality of two people kissing, that these figures are just vaguely human. But what it forgoes with that is that he's trying to bring the idea here of what we would feel with the feeling of romantic love, and that is being locked together with your complementary half here for life. And so these two people kind of becoming this union of one thing is better translated in this abstract manner as opposed to something that would be very, very naturalistic. Okay, so it's kind of interesting that with Brancusi he talks about it being simplicity, because a lot of times abstract art it is simplified to the basic art elements. That there is a level of simplification with a lot of it. Okay, around this time we have the development of photography. We saw the development of it earlier in the mid-1800s, but now it's really developed as an art form. That earlier on it was kind of used as a tool, and now people are starting to recognize its artistic potential. And in this case, we have the photographer named Alfred Stieglitz, and this is called the steerage. Very famous photograph here, and it's pretty interesting what he's doing in terms of form and content, the form of what it looks like and the content of the meaning. You can see here we have the division of the classes, the upper class on the top and the lower class on the bottom, the lower section. And that's divided here by the levels that we see. And on the top we have a white background with the sky, and the figures show up in black. On the bottom they're in the shadow, so it's more of a black background, and the figures show up in white. So we already have that white to dark contrast with the black and white photograph here. And so that kind of speaks to the division of the classes. And then we also have these really strong diagonal lines here. That we have the two vertical lines on the outside, which are being balanced by the horizontal lines there in the middle and the top. So that gives us a structure and a composition for the scene here. That when Picasso sees this photograph, he says that this photographer is working in the same spirit that I am. So he recognizes here some of the same artistic concerns. Okay, let's take a look at architecture. And with modern architecture, certainly our most well-known and most influential artist of the modern era would be this guy. His name is Frank Lloyd Wright, and this is an example of one of his works. This is called the Robbie House. And with his architecture here, you can see something we see a lot with modern architecture, and that it really does go with really basic forms. In this case, it's the rectangular shape here that's used kind of over and again and again. And we have a balance of those vertical and horizontal elements, similar to what we see here. This balance is with the diagonals. With the architecture here, it's more of the rectangulars that are vertically and horizontally balanced. One of the influential ideas that Mr. Wright has is that architecture should fit in with its surroundings, that it should be a fluid part of the landscape. And so one really good example of that in his work is this one. This is called Falling Water. That's what it's known as. It's also known as the Kaufman Residence. And you can see here it really does fit in with its surroundings. And that we have this waterfall, and we have these different levels of the waterfall being echoed by the different levels of the house itself. And so those horizontal levels that we see are balanced here by the vertical elements as well. And here we very literally have it interacting and being a fluid part of the landscape, since that river is running here through the bottom of the house. So Frank Lloyd Wright, very influential architect of the modern era. Okay, these next artists are examples of artists in the way that they're trying to show motion. And one way you would be able to show motion is through abstract elements. For instance, if I were to give you a drawing on something that is moving, let's say I would try to pick an object that moves through the air, something like a football. One way I would show the football moving is I would want to put that football more on a diagonal as opposed to being balanced vertically or horizontally. I would want it on a diagonal. That's already going to give it a sense of movement. And another thing I would do is I would add like little swooshes behind it, little lines, little directional forces that make it look like it's moving through the air. Or another thing I could do is kind of repeat the football to show where in the air that it's passing as far as its path is concerned. And so if I looked at those things, those would be some abstract ways to show it moving. For instance, if we were to look at a football, we wouldn't see lines behind the football as it's being thrown through the air. Those lines would be an example of how you are abstracting something to show the flow of something. And so that's what we'll see with a lot of art around this time. That's one reason why artists are moving to abstraction, is because they're trying to show this reality they wouldn't be able to show otherwise. And so here we see an example of it in sculpture. This is Umberto Boccioni, and the title of this sculpture is Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. And so as we see with one foot in front of the other, that pose is something that can create a sense of movement for sure. And also another thing that we see is the abstract art elements we were talking about, that in addition to the pose, we have these little forms, the way that they're shown, of kind of coming off the behind, basically from behind the figure, and so it gives more of an added impetus, like the figure is stepping forward because of those little abstract elements, kind of showing its wake. All right, in painting, we see this shown here by this example. This is Marcel Duchamp, and this is Nude Descending Staircase number 2. And so he's being influenced by the cubism that he sees from Picasso and Braque and other people at this time. But he's also showing the nude descending a staircase, that motion. So we see that diagonal. We see the repetition of the figure, and we see these little swooshes here to imply the directional force that that figure is taking. This was in the Armory show, which I think around 1912, 1913 or so. They grouped a lot of these avant-garde artists in Europe. They put their work together, and they brought it to New York and Philadelphia, Chicago, some major cities in the United States, for the American public to be able to see this new different art. And one of the critics referred to this painting as an explosion in a shingles factory. And so if we were to view this art in that traditional paradigm of something that represents reality, naturalism, then we would see how it might represent that. But even if we took that idea of an explosion in the shingles factory, what it represents there is that implied movement. That even if you were to think it's an explosion of the shingles factory, which it's not, we would see the idea of motion being represented in that idea, which is really the paradigm that Duchamp is working with here, of trying to show this, this motion, the movement of this figure here. All right, so this next style is actually something called the style, at least that's what it translates to. It's something called de style. And this is happening in Europe, and it's seen by this artist, Mr. Piet Mondrian. And this is a painting called Tableau 2. And so here you can see that we really have no real reference towards reality, that here in abstract art it's really simply about the aspects of its own design. And with Mondrian here, a lot of his artwork is about kind of an efficient means of creating a design that's balanced and harmonized. And we see that here. There's actually not very much of this painting that is covered in some type of design element. We basically see a white background, we see a few lines and a few colors, and some very basic shapes. But it creates a balanced overall composition with what he's working with here. And so de style here is a particular style that they're working with that's supposed to become the style. And this is true with a lot of really abstract work, that a lot of times with abstract work there's kind of this utopian ideal, that there's going to be this kind of one consciousness of art here that everybody can kind of relate to. That's something, an idea, again, that we see a lot with art that's this abstract. Now, take a look at this painting and try to imagine maybe what a building would look like if it was done in this style, de style. And you might come up with something like this. Okay, this is by an artist named Gerrit Rietveld, and the one on the left is called Schroeder House, and on the right here is Red and Blue Chair. And you can see how it's essentially the same style, de style here, being used in terms of architecture that we saw there with the painting. Alright, so the next two things we're going to see here is we're going to see one style called Dada, and then after that we'll see another style called Surrealism. One of the reasons why we have a lot of different artists to look at here in modern art, why we have to break it into two sections, is that artists are doing a lot of different things, so we have a lot of isms. And part of the reason, like I mentioned earlier, we see that is because artists are trying to do new and different things. And so one of the things that is different, that is influenced by the culture, is what we would call Dada. And so Dada is kind of hard to explain because Dada itself is a word that doesn't have a meaning. It's kind of like baby speak. And it is kind of a revolutionary type style because these artists are kind of rebelling against society to a certain extent. That World War I is approaching, and they're trying to kind of point out the absurdity of the culture that believed in progression, that believed in science and technology, making us smarter, making us a better civilization. But then, when World War I is going to break out, a lot of that is going to be undermined because, what's the point of technology if we're just killing each other at a higher rate? And so that kind of absurdity is what they're trying to point out. And so we can see on the left there, this is Marcel Duchamp again, the same guy who did Nude Descending a Staircase, #2, that we just saw. And here he is kind of making fun here of the overall social structure, and so he picks something that would be emblematic of the society, so to speak, and so he picks a very famous painting, the Mona Lisa here. And he's drawing a little mustache and goatee on the Mona Lisa. And on the bottom, he has LHOOQ, which in French, if we looked at L, that would mean she. And so if we spell it out, it would basically mean she has a hot rear end, is what he's saying there at the bottom. And so it's a subversive style, again, that's pointing out kind of the absurdity here of what's going on in the world. Similarly, we have Man Ray with his sculpture Cadeau, which means gift, on the right. And here, obviously, if we had an iron like that, it would do more harm than good, which can be associated with maybe some of the technology of the times. That, with technology, it can be great and everything, but it can also be very bad. For instance, we have bombs and guns that can, shoot, like Tommy guns, things like that can do a lot of damage in a short period of time. And there's a few artists here that start off as Dada artists that after the war they become surrealists. So surrealists are this next kind of style here. Surrealism would be kind of our next ism. And what they're going to see as kind of a solution for some of the problems in society is the idea of championing the subconscious. And so a lot of their work is indebted to the psychology of Sigmund Freud, the idea that the subconscious is a little bit more pure than the conscious ego. And so surrealism is trying to get both of those states together, the dream state, the fantasy state, together with the conscious state, into kind of this supreme reality, something they call surreality, and so that's where we get the term surrealism. And so this example here is done by the artist Max Ernst, and this is called The Horde. And you can see with surrealism it's going to look very much like fantasy or hallucination or some type of dreamlike world. Maybe the best example of a surrealist is this artist. His name is Salvador Dali, a very well-known artist. This is called The Persistence of Memory. So Dali once said, the difference between me and the surrealists is that I am a surrealist. Okay, so it's kind of a little funny quote there, but there's a certain amount of truth to what he says, because a lot of these surrealists kind of move on to different things, whereas Dali, that just seems to be his style. His style just looks really, really otherworldly, like it would be some type of fantasy or dreamlike world. So this is Persistence of Memory. This is another one of his works here. And this one here is called The Temptation of St. Anthony. And so, yeah, he just got a kind of a strange, kind of weird style to him. He was certainly kind of a weird individual as well, but certainly a very talented artist. Now, another surrealist of note would be the artist René Magritte. He's also pretty interesting. A lot of scholars find his work pretty interesting. This is one of his images here. This is called The Treachery of Images. And so here we see this pipe, and then underneath he writes "Ceci n'est pas un pipe," which means this is not a pipe. So why would you paint a picture of a pipe and then underneath say this is not a pipe? Well, if we look at his title there, The Treachery of Images, we can get a little idea as far as what that might be. So basically what he's saying here, to a certain extent, is that the thing with art, the thing with images, is that they're not the things themselves. As in, this is not the object of a pipe. All this is a picture of a pipe. It's a sign or a signal or a symbol of a pipe. And that's what art is in its nature, symbolic in nature. It's not the thing itself. And so that's why Magritte is popular. He's seen as asking a lot of interesting questions about art. Here we can see another couple of examples. The painting on the right is called The Human Condition. And so here we see this painting that is just barely showing up as a painting because it's right up against the landscape that it would have been painted from. And so it's, kind of asking the question of what art is, what is our values of art, what makes something art. And so we have that natural landscape there in the background, and then the painting that is the art itself in the foreground, and how it's hard to tell the difference. The only way we can tell it's a painting is because it's on an easel, and we can see the side of the canvas there. And of course, it's actually a painting of a painting, and so there's a lot of interesting dynamics he's working with there. And on the left, we see one of his paintings that's called The Empire of Light. And so here we can see how he's showing the sky like it's daytime, and then the bottom section there like it's nighttime. So that's what his work is a lot like. It's usually something kind of a little bit off, or a little bit kind of a little bit interesting about his work. This is the artist Frida Kahlo. A lot of times she's grouped in with the Surrealists, but she's working in Mexico here, and her work just happens to kind of look kind of otherworldly or like a fantasy or a dream sometimes. She's not really kind of affiliated with a lot of these artists, really. But she is a very famous artist in Mexico and here in America as well. And she had a kind of a long history of a lot of physical and mental ailments, a lot of pain she had to endure during her life, and a lot of her artwork is about that. And so we see that here. This is called The Two Fridas. And so she's a pretty well-known artist here at this time. And another well-known artist that we looked at earlier is Pablo Picasso, but he does have a long career, and so around this time he paints Guernica, which is this painting here, a very large mural he did based on the bombing that happened of the city of Guernica in Spain, where he was from in the First World War. And so here he's kind of showing the atrocities that happened with that bombing, kind of an example of social activism here. Now, a lot of artists around America here are working through the WPA, which is the Works Progress Administration. We have what is known as American Regionalists that are being funded a lot of times by these government programs, part of the New Deal from Roosevelt after the Great Depression. We have the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, that fund a lot of these artists. And so one of the examples of an artist that kind of comes from that background is Grant Wood here. And this is a very famous painting called American Gothic. And this is kind of an example here of sometimes how you'll have kind of an odd reason why artists decide to do what they do. He claims that he made this painting because he was driving by this house and he really liked the window. He wanted to do a painting with that house. And so we got these two people to pose for him. That the two people here that are showing up as a couple aren't even a couple, and that's not even their house. The person on the left is the artist's sister, and the person on the right is the artist's dentist. That he's just posing them here together to stand in front of the background that he really liked. And so this kind of is a painting that comes to symbolize here kind of that American Midwestern farmer. And we have Mr. Henry Moore here, a sculptor, very well-known sculptor of the 20th century here, and this is called Recumbent Figure. And it's a good example of the type of art that we see here with modernism. The paradigm again here doing something not completely naturalistic here, something that is way more abstract in its focus, which again, expression is the whole paradigm of this era. Okay, so this will do it here as far as the first section of modernism, and when we come back we'll go into what we call high modern art, and then basically to the art of today.